Now, I'm not saying that rugby is bad and children shouldn't play rugby. It's that recognition that when you are involved in physical activity, there is a small chance, it's still a small chance for the hours of rugby that people can and children can get injured, but it is significantly lower in resistance training. Hello and welcome back to what is the final episode of the Smart Strength Training podcast of 2024. And we're finishing off this year's podcast with a question: should teenagers lift weights? Two reasons why I want to cover this topic. Firstly is it's been asked in my Q&A a decent amount of times over the course of the last couple of years. And also one of the main reasons I like talking about certain topics is to show how the evidence sits alongside some of the beliefs. And because there is some fairly new research, or certainly a fairly new systematic review highlighting some of the issues we've had within the myths and misconceptions around the topic of should teenagers lift weights. And because a lot of people that follow me have children, of course, and this question is something where there's not a lot of good evidence that seems to get well publicized and spoken about. So some of the really, really old myths that certainly were around when I first came into industry back in the early 2000s still center and circulate these days, and they're very, very strongly believed. So let's go through the key myth or the key belief and misconception around resistance training, strength training, and children, and that's that it stunts growth. So the misconception stems from the misunderstanding about growth plates. So growth plates are the area where tissue is grown, bone is grown effectively, and they're referred to as the epiphyseal plate. Now, the epiphyseal plate plays a crucial role in bone growth during childhood and adolescence, and it's obviously where bone is produced from. So therefore, it contributes towards a person's height overall. Growth plates are found at the end of long bones, and because they are softer and more flexible than bone, and then during growth, these plates ossify, they harden, and the plate then closes, usually later in adolescence. And key growth plates are in the femur, tibia, ulna, radius, and in the phalanges, and in the fingers and in the toes. And because growth plates, as I mentioned, they're softer, they are more susceptible to injury. And this is probably where this is certainly where the belief around this and the misconception starts. So early research looked at growth plate injuries and primarily found that sports such as football, gymnastics, rugby, and weightlifting showed significant trauma to these areas. However, so this systematic review went through and looked at this information and found that it was certainly from the resistance training standpoint, it was from improper use, it was from heavy loads that were beyond the capability of the athlete, because this was done in sports, children who are participating in sport, or using unsafe equipment. So it was effectively more sort of freak accident and incident, plus also recognizing that this was research just looking at growth plate injuries. So it wasn't looking at the rates of injuries in that particular research paper, and that stemmed this belief then that resistance training was going to cause major issues. But it's worth stating as a whole that high impact sports have much, much higher injury rates than resistance training. Anything that involves repetitive jumping or taking direct blows, such as basketball and rugby, show they have a much higher rate of injury than resistance training. But in that initial study, that was all just lumped into the same category without subdividing it down. For years, the fitness industry and medical community believed that heavy resistance training was going to cause these injuries. There was also the belief that it could prematurely close those epiphyseal plates, which would halt growth. And there is a concern around overtraining as a whole in adolescence. So again, a lot of this research stems around children participate in sport and add resistance training in. So therefore, it's additive to an already busy schedule. So as I mentioned, we've had quite recent research. So in 2023, a systematic review came out, which clearly showed, or certainly showed that back history around where these myths came from, what the early research was, and then looking at the more recent research to show that when appropriately supervised, strength training poses no risk to the growth plates overall, or health in a child or adolescent. So what's really interesting looking at this research is those injury rates that I mentioned. So the systematic review showed that injury rates in resistance training were set at 0.053 to 0.176 for every 100 hours that a child interacts with resistance training. So that's between 0.053 to 0.176. Whereas in rugby, in comparison, that starts at 0.65 up to 1.06 for every 100 hours of rugby. So the lower end for resistance training is 0.053, whereas for rugby, it's 0.65. So injury rates in contact sports are significantly higher than that of resistance training. Now, I'm not saying that rugby is bad and children shouldn't play rugby. It's that recognition that when you are involved in physical activity, there is a small chance, it's still a small chance for the hours of rugby that people can and children can get injured, but it is significantly lower in resistance training. And again, just to to state that a lot of these injuries do seem to stem from poor supervision, inadequate machinery, or improper programming as a whole. So one of the things as well that I have heard sort of floating around this topic is the belief that I don't want a child to build lots of muscle because then that will affect mobility somehow, or just don't want children to bulk up. We have such limited evidence when it comes to pre-pubertal children and hypertrophy. The research that is out there shows pretty low increases in hypertrophy. Children can get stronger, but potentially due to the lower testosterone levels pre-puberty, hypertrophy seems to be much, much less pronounced. So it's not something you'd have to worry about, certainly from where the research currently sits. So let's talk about some sort of broader considerations. So why I think there are some major benefits to allowing children to start taking part in resistance training. Resistance training can certainly boost confidence, and it can install lifelong habits around fitness as a whole. It can help with combating body image issues, which is common in adolescence. Resistance training is also a potent tool against childhood obesity and metabolic disorders, so it always encourages people to start as early as possible. And just encourages that sort of positive peer interaction within a structured sort of gym environment. Again, I think this sort of thing should be structured, it should be supervised. And just a recognition that strength training is a skill element to it. Resistance training needs motor skill acquisition. You have to learn sort of proprioception, body positioning, coordination, all that kind of stuff. So let's now think of some practical recommendations for teens. And again, a caveat to this that all the research stems around young athletes that do resistance training. So that is a limitation to what I'm about to talk about. And in fairness, though, what I'm talking about now is, I think, very logical and probably is very true for anyone, not just for adolescents. But again, going back to the idea that resistance training requires this coordination element to it. If you're working with external load, you have to understand your body's position in space to do that, work on proprioception. And that's what I think is really great about resistance training. All movement is great, but I think what's nice about resistance training beyond maybe just playing rugby and sport is you have to go through a greater range of motion. You have that external load. You have to slow down, really feel the movement. I think that can be a really good thing to expose adolescents to. But you need, of course, to start light. You start for loads that are appropriate around 12 to 15 reps, and you progress nice and gradually because you want to improve the skill as well as the strength of the exercise. And of course, technique needs to be really, really focused on. And again, like I said, all those things are very, very true for adults too. It's worth stating that for younger athletes and for adolescents that involve in any sport, really, the recovery rates are quicker than that of adults. That being said, children should still have to rest for sort of 2 to 3 minutes. This should be supervised. So a qualified coach, or at least someone that knows exercise technique and can manage the sort of loading of the exercises is a really smart thing to do. And of course, like appropriate equipment, safe equipment are non-negotiables when it comes to resistance training. And then when adolescents start to build that base of understanding of the movements, then actually to start to alternate between some strength work and some power work, so moving a little bit quicker. And again, that idea is the same for adults. You'd start with slow movements, then you'd go a little bit heavier, and then you'd look to move the movements, move them faster, including things like plyometrics, including things like body weight exercises as well. So let's just finish off going through some additional concerns. One of these I've sort of touched on already, but that idea of like, won't lifting heavy make a kid bulky? And as I mentioned, we have such limited research on this topic, but the research that is there shows that hypertrophy doesn't seem to be something that that children pre-pubescent can actually achieve an awful lot of. Something around, again, because this research centers around sports, like shouldn't children just do sport-specific training instead of lifting? I think it's a really important takeaway, not just for children weightlifting, for anyone, that getting stronger improves overall performance in things like agility, speed, and power, just generally. And the problem with sport-specific training can be it's quite challenging to do. It's quite complex to do. So it's quite nice to bring this down to kind of basic movement patterns and then explore back out. So never think that sport-specific movements are more beneficial than just getting stronger, because just getting stronger will be the preference first, and then sprinkling in some sport-specific things afterwards. And then is weightlifting better than other forms of training for kids? It's not better. I would always suggest that like it's nice to have children involved in team sports or sports as a whole, but the more options that children have to use, the better. So certainly it's hard to say, because you have to say what's better. How do you put better into context? It's very subjective. What's better for one child won't necessarily be better for the other. But I certainly think it's a great tool. And if you have a kid that wants to get involved in resistance training, there certainly is nothing from a research standpoint that would have me worried about saying it's absolutely safe to do. So just to wrap this up, just really to state that when it's supervised, resistance training is 100% safe and beneficial for youth to get involved in. That initial concern around stunting growth is definitely not accurate, but of course, all sports carry risk, and therefore, again, when it's supervised, it's going to be very, very safe to do. We do need more research on this area. It's something that hasn't been researched extensively, certainly not with high quality research. So that's just something to put out there as a caveat. And just thinking about the broader topic around how resistance training really can foster those lifelong habits around health and fitness. And for that, I think both for adults and for kids, I think it's a great thing for everyone to be involved in. That's it for 2024. And I'll start 2025 definitely on topics more around, I guess, what a lot of people are going to be thinking about in the new years, which is going to be weight loss.